Great, thank you for joining the CCIH virtual conference. Our discussion today is on the trauma response and curricula, and we're going to wait a couple more minutes while people join. So go get that cup of tea or coffee and glass of water while we're waiting. So thank you for joining us. If you've just jumped on, we're going to get started in a couple of minutes, but welcome to the CCIH virtual conference. And yeah, just go get your cup of tea or coffee or glass of water, whatever it is, so that you're ready for when we start. It's just in a few minutes. Welcome if you've just joined us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, but welcome to the CCIH virtual conference. Great to see so many of you joining. We'll just start in a minute. Okay, well, welcome to the CCIH virtual conference, and thank you for joining our discussion today on trauma response and curricula. You're very welcome, and yeah, we really look forward to engaging with you throughout this session. My name's Leanne Kennedy. Welcome. If you are new to CCIH, it is an international network of approximately 115 Christian organizations and 15 secular partners, as well as a few hundred members, individual members. CCIH mission is to promote health and wholeness from a Christian perspective and provides opportunities for capacity building, networking, sharing best practice and advocacy. we can just move to the next slide. Really delighted to share that this week of the conference is sponsored by AmeriCares. AmeriCares saves lives and improves health for people affected by poverty or disaster so they can reach their full potential. And again, really thank you to AmeriCares for supporting this week's conference. Next slide. So just before I introduce myself, I'd love just to share with you a little bit about how today is going to work. So we would love to invite you to participate. And so you feel free to type questions into the chat function, which is at the side of the YouTube video. Now, in order for you to post questions, you do need to be signed into Google and have a YouTube channel, even if there are no videos on it. So if you have a Google account, please do sign in now so that you can post questions live. If you don't have a Google account, don't worry, please send us any questions you have to webinar@ccih.org, and we'll get those and we'll be able to share those with Brian and Paul a little bit later. So just a reminder, if you want to post questions, you need to be signed into your Google account, or please email us at webinar@ccih.org and we'll get those. So I just encourage you as we go through today, we're going to listen to both presentations to begin with, and then we'll open up for a time of Q&A. But as you listen to both presentations, and if it sparks any questions, please do post those so that we can respond to them later. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the CCIH YouTube channel in a conference playlist. And you'll find links to the recordings on the CCIH website. And that's at www.ccih.org. And I'll repeat that website URL address a couple of times throughout this session because there's some fantastic resources available for you. But so as I've just shared, my name's Leanne Kennedy. I'm co-founder and CEO of Thrive Worldwide. Thrive Worldwide exists to support organizations to thrive. So we look after people and organizations in providing staff health and well-being support, organizational culture and leadership consultancy services, as well as support on safeguarding. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm very privileged to be moderating today's session. I'm really looking forward to it. I've had the opportunity to have a sneak preview of the presentations, and so I can share with you in advance that we're in for a really great session. But as we move forward, I'd love to introduce you to Paul Shetler-Fast, who's going to deliver our first presentation. So Paul is the Global Health Coordinator for the Mennonite Central Committee, MCC, and currently supports the health programming with the local community partners in over 50 countries. And prior to this, Paul was based in Haiti as the country representative, managing a variety of relief and humanitarian responses. He has a master's degree in public health and international development, and specializes monitoring and evaluation of programs, particularly in the field of mental health. And delighted to have Paul share with us today. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much. Greetings all. Thank you, Leanne, for that kind introduction, Brian for joining me on the panel, and of course to CCIH for the opportunity to share with you today. Next slide. Before I start, I also want to acknowledge and pay respect to all of you who have taken the time to join the call and the years of experience and wisdom that you bring to this work. I hope what I share can be useful to you. And a special hello and shikamo to an old friend, Mzee Magiri from the Tanzania Mennonite Church, who's on the call and actually gave me my first taste of public health as a little kid riding on the back of his motorcycle, where we'd have the cooler full of vaccines and meds on the back. So asante sana, Mzee. As Leanne said, my name is Paul Shetler-Fast, and I'm the Global Health Coordinator for MCC. And next slide. Today, I'd like to first give a brief overview of MCC's trauma work, how we got into this kind of work, and then speak briefly about why we thought it was necessary to do this sort of broad sector evaluation looking across multiple projects in multiple countries, and how we went about doing this evaluation. And finally, I'd like to share some of the key lessons we've learned, recommendations coming out of this that I think might be useful to you in your context. Next. MCC was founded 100 years ago in 1920 during a time of war and famine and pandemic. The world was just coming out of a world war. The Russian Revolution and accompanying famines and violence were ongoing in the area where MCC first concentrated its efforts. And the devastating influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu, was just winding down after taking an estimated 50 million lives. MCC was founded to respond to this suffering with a focus on humanitarian relief. But importantly, even in 1920, psychological and spiritual needs were seen as integral to this work from that very beginning. And I would just like to point quickly to this quote from MCC's first report from the field, what we would call today a needs assessment, where the authors note that not only were food and clothing and livestock taken from people, leading to physical suffering, but that people were in constant fear of plunder and robbery and rape, of terror. What we heard everywhere were harrowing, heartrending stories of suffering, sadness, and demoralization. And that could have been written today about so many of the places where we work. Responding in the name of Christ has always meant more than just responding to physical needs, and trauma response work particularly has been one of the fastest growing parts of MCC's work around the world for the last several decades. Next slide. So, which is why we felt it was time to conduct a significant evaluation of this work. MCC is a very decentralized organization with programs around the world working directly with small local partners to develop programming that's locally responsive. And this means that we're using different approaches around the world all at the same time. And the purpose of the evaluation was first just to understand what was the scope of that diversity, what was being done, why was it being done, what could we learn from it. Secondly, to develop an internal framework to categorize the approaches taken to that work. And then finally, to develop concrete recommendations for going forward. And just a quick note, the focus of this evaluation was only on externally community-facing trauma response work, not on trauma-related worker care or HR policies or making our internal operations trauma-informed. That's valuable work, but it was outside the scope of this particular evaluation. Next slide. So the evaluation itself was focused on 18 case studies in 8 countries, which you can see listed here. These projects were selected to give geographic diversity, diversity of trauma approach being used, and the diversity of the driver behind that trauma, whether that was war or natural disaster or other local drivers. For 11 of those projects, I was actually able to do the field visits myself alongside local evaluation team members, allowing us to conduct focus groups and interviews with participants and community stakeholders. And then an additional 21 disciplinary expert interviews with MCC staff and partners to really dive into each of these approaches in detail. Next slide. From this, we developed a framework to understand the diverse ways of coming at the issue of trauma. And I know there's a lot on this slide and the next slide, and don't worry, I am not going to read it all, but I want you to have it for future reference and be able to maybe look at the parts that apply most to you in more detail. The idea of this framework is that each of these approaches is informed by its own disciplinary perspective, its own research literature, and that it needs to be understood on its own terms. And I've represented these categories as overlapping circles because they are not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of gray area, there's a lot of overlap, but using these categories can bring a little more intellectual clarity to what we mean when we say trauma response work. So on the far left, you can see a framework growing out of community development, out of community building, community cohesion, social capital kind of fields. This approach to trauma is rooted in seeing trauma as coming from social division, exclusion, inequality. Next, you'll see two approaches often grouped under peace and justice sort of headings. These are termed community healing and rights-based approaches. Community healing focuses on recurring cycles of violence against self or others as drivers of individual and community trauma, and how do we interrupt those cycles. A rights-based approach focuses on trauma as resulting from violations of people's rights and the systemic systems of injustice and oppression which create that trauma. And finally, we have two health style approaches on the right. First, public health, looking at traumatic exposure as driving population ill health, concentrated among particular groups, and then having a lens of prevention. And finally, clinical health, which is really drilling down to the individual and specific clinical diagnoses and treatment. Next slide. And so when we understand these approaches and where they're coming from, we can understand the intervention methods and strategies that they recommend, and even be able to begin to understand why they should be evaluated differently and why understanding their impact is going to depend on which approach we are coming from. And again, you don't have to read this now. You can find the whole chart and the resources accompanying it on the CCIH website. But I want to highlight a few points here. One, the presentation you're going to hear from next from Brian is an example listed here. The Healing the Wounds of Trauma approach, that curriculum, is an example of a community healing approach. And you can see other examples within that approach that you may have heard of, things like STAR or HEROC, Singing to the Lions, Alternatives to Violence. Those are all methods within that approach. And these community healing interventions have their own distinct theory of change underlying them. And they should not be confused with, let's say, a clinical mental health post-traumatic stress disorder treatment program, or a public health approach looking to reduce exposure to violence for the most at-risk kids, or a rights-based approach that is looking at better legal protections for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. These are very different approaches, and they all come at it in a different way, have different types of indicators we would want to look for change. They are each appropriate to their own setting. Next slide. However, like I said, these are not mutually exclusive approaches. And what we found is that every project we evaluated blended at least two of these approaches, and most blended at least 3 or 4. And this is great, and it led to better, more holistic work. But it's important to understand that each of those approaches has their own theory of change. And so if you're going to understand the impact of a holistic program, it's important to understand where each of those bits are coming from so that we can evaluate them appropriately. Next slide. And so this brings me to key lessons and recommendations coming out of this work. The first, which I would just underline many times, is an encouragement to rely more on strong, diverse local partners. These people understand their context, they understand the local realities and culture and the needs and what is likely to work. And projects are strongest when we rely on those people as the primary drivers of programming, rather than outside experts coming in with prepackaged sort of initiatives. Very connected to this work is best when it is contextualized, when it is culturally adapted, when it is locally owned, when it's connected to people's meaning-making systems, their faith, and you're going to hear more about that from Brian, when it can connect into how they understand the world, how they make meaning out of suffering, it is going to work better. And that needs to be based on a rigorous needs assessment of local needs, local priorities, and implementation capacity. And when we're doing this work, we can and should insist on higher standards of situation assessment and project design, of rigorous theories of change, of using good monitoring and evaluation methods, of ensuring the implementers have strong capacities, and the technical skills to do this. These are no longer new fields. Each of these approaches, there's strong research and literature behind them, and we should lean into that and insist on high standards. Next slide. Since this is a health conference, a few health-specific recommendations that came out of evaluating that end of programming. One is an encouragement that raising awareness in and of itself should not be the goal of our work. Raising awareness is a means to other ends. And so as we raise awareness, to ensure that when we're raising awareness about trauma, we are connecting it back to the purpose of that work, whether it's destigmatizing it, whether it's increasing care seeking, whether it's breaking down barriers so people can share openly about this. Those are all important ends, and we should make sure that our awareness raising work is actually contributing to that. Two, at a minimum, any project, whether or not it is a clinical mental health project, needs to ensure that if we're talking about trauma and bringing up these issues, people who need urgent clinical care are appropriately referred. Don't have to have the skills yourself, but be able to assess and refer when those issues come up. And finally, to note that clinical mental health projects require some of the highest levels of technical expertise, mastery of evidence-based practice, and deep localization. And not all partners, not all of us are well placed to do that work. And so knowing what we are good at and then picking the approach where we're most likely to be successful. Next slide. And so to summarize, a quote from a dear friend, a Haitian man who I worked with in Haiti, a former MCCer who runs a trauma-focused organization, Wozo Haiti. And as I was interviewing about this work, he had this quote, which I think really summarizes our key findings. He said, the trauma needs of different people in different places with different cultures and religions at different times are just too complex for one-size-fits-all programs that are imported from the outside. And I love this image he has at the end. The roots of a problem are not observable from the sky. And so neither are the best solutions going to be designed on an airplane, in other words, by consultants. And so just a real strong affirmation from the ground about the importance of deep localization in this work. And so I will wrap up there. Next slide, and turn it back over to Leanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for that excellent presentation. I'm sure that you could have talked for days about that subject, and there's so much rich content in there. Can I encourage you that if you have a question for Paul, please post that in the YouTube chat. And also just a reminder, Paul mentioned several resources as part of his presentation. And if you want to have access to those, please go to the CCIH website, which is www.ccih.org, and under resources you'll see a section on mental health where you can find some of the resources that Paul mentioned. I'm going to move us forward and introduce Brian. I'm really excited to introduce Brian to you and to move on to our second presentation. Brian Varnkamp has served with SIL International for 33 years, and he first served in Nepal and then in South Asia for 23 years, facilitating a translation project. From 2012 to 2016, he coordinated scripture engagement activities around the world. Now, Brian is currently the Global Trauma Healing Services Coordinator for SIL International. And as a master facilitator of the Trauma Healing Institute, he's got extensive experience in developing trauma healing materials. And today we're going to learn a little bit more about the work of the Trauma Healing Institute. And so, Brian, I'd love to hand over to you. Brian, you're on mute.
Thank you, Paul, for a great introduction to this topic, and for Leanne, and for CCIH for the opportunity to share. My name is Brian Varnkamp, and I am representing SIL International, SIL Lead, and the Trauma Healing Institute. Next. What I'd like us to do is first look at what is Bible-based trauma healing. Next. Next. So, what is trauma? What are we talking about? It's always good to have a good description of where we are, so we're all on the same page. From our perspective, we're looking at when people are overwhelmed with intense fear, helplessness, or horror. This is trauma. It can be an injury caused by a single event, a prolonged event, or repeated events that overwhelm a person's normal ability to cope. Next. Just a quick glance at some of the scope of trauma. I think many of you know these things, but 35% of women worldwide have some sort of violent or sexually violent experience in their life. 1 billion children have been abused in some way. And that means that 1 to 5 women or 1 in 13 men have been sexually abused as a child. Nearly 71 million people around the world have been forced to leave from their homes, and that's by disaster or by political situations. It kind of rounds out to 1 person being displaced roughly every 2 seconds. But there are other forms of trauma in the world: suicide, addictions, divorce, loss of many different things, unexpected loss of a loved one. Natural disasters can cause many of these kinds of things or have the impact on people's lives. I always like to ask the question, what about you? What kind of trauma perhaps has invaded your life and the lives of those that you are around? Next. The program began around the turn of the century in the Democratic Republic of Congo to try to address the results of terrible trauma. It was grassroots, and now it has become global. It's a combination of best mental health practices and biblical principles. And it's purposely easy to teach, easy to translate, and easy for church leaders to teach others. So it went from the DRC to literally around the world. We are in 112 countries, and you can see some more of the statistics there. We are in, the materials are in 148 unique languages, and more are being developed. Next. What is the structure? There is a Trauma Healing Institute that's led by a Trauma Healing Alliance, a global collaboration of ministries. And the Alliance extends out to even nearly 600 different partner organizations that we work with. There's an advisory council that oversees the integrity of the program, the materials that are developed, the biblical input, the mental health input. There are mental health professionals and counselors that are involved at every stage. We have many of these kinds of people who are trained facilitators. And then we have many different trauma healing facilitators around the world. Next. What are the things that we focus on? There are core lessons that we feel are important for everyone who has been traumatized. And that is just grapple with the idea of why are we suffering if God really loves us? How can the wounds of our hearts be healed? What is trauma? How is it affecting our bodies? How is it affecting our ability to cope? And how can we listen well? And what really happens when someone is grieving? And grieving is good. It's God-given. And that leads into composing laments. Somewhere along the line in the healing process, we need to bring that pain to the cross or to Jesus to let him heal. And then over time, the process of forgiveness is very important. But we also have very specific topics that we cover. And again, this goes back to the contextualization. What are the problems that people are dealing with in their own communities? This is done by talking with people, finding out what do they need, what are the different issues that their community is dealing with. Next. A typical process for healing for people is that the suffering happens and they are first given a place, a space that is safe, that they can be heard. Their story needs to be told, and that is the first step in healing. As they do that, they can begin to really grieve in a healthy way, and we encourage lamenting, crying out to God, bringing the pain to the cross, leading to forgiveness, all the while rebuilding their lives and growing in resilience. Next. So how does it work? Let's take a look at that. Next. The lessons are anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, or they can be divided and take even longer if people are sharing and need to work through issues and want to talk. We always begin with a modern life story that introduces the situation so that they aren't forced to tell their stories straight away. We define what we're talking about. And one of the important parts is to look at what is culture saying about it. What did they come to? What is their perspective about what's going on in their lives? Sometimes this aligns well with what the scripture says, sometimes it doesn't. So we always want to look at what God's word says about it. The Bible is a book of trauma. One trauma after another, that God intervenes and shows his loving kindness to us in various different ways. So the Bible is full of help for people who have been traumatized. Then we talk about what helps for your own healing, or maybe if you're walking alongside someone else, what will help them? And in doing so, we also talk about what doesn't help. What are some of those things that make it difficult to heal? We use expressive exercises throughout the lesson and try to engage other parts of the brain in some sort of closing. All of this is included with personal engagement throughout. Next. So we use adult learning principles, and it's very participatory. You can see there some of the different things that we use. The goal is to get a group interacting with one another, not to have some teacher up front teaching principles, but rather people sharing with one another, building a community so that they can rely on one another, they can share with one another. Even after they have perhaps gone through a healing group, they can then move into a more community that is supportive of one another. Next. It's designed to be used with small groups, and the main focus is a healing group. That's what we're after. It's used by trained lay people and kept simple on purpose. Next. How do you become involved? Our goal is to lead healing groups. So you come to an initial equipping, you get some practice, you come back to an advanced equipping, then we have ongoing mentoring, and a community of practice that's either local or regional or global. And the goal is to become an excellent healing group facilitator. Next. Contextualization, Paul mentioned this. It's very important that we have contextualization. You can see there that we have story-based versions where it's only oral. We have arts and trauma healing where we focus more on the arts. We have a Muslim-friendly version that I think some of you may be very interested in, that is still in somewhat development stages, but so far we're getting really good results with that. We look at generational trauma, the racism, missionary version. There's a children's version that is very successful and a new teens version. We focus on different story sets depending on where people are from. What do they need? We look at indigenous art forms, and sometimes we change the order of the lessons or sections depending on the audience. And it's all within the participatory approach. But what looks participatory in Thailand may look different from what's participatory in Africa, and we try to adapt that. Next. So does it work? What's the impact? Next. Well, we did do some research, and nearly 3,000 people participated from around the world. And to cut to the chase, overall statistically significant was a decrease in most symptoms of trauma for 91% of the participants. Not just while they're doing it, but it lasted into the future. An increase in engagement with Bible and God. an improvement in emotional and spiritual health, and a decrease was noticed in domestic abuse and suicide in churches. Next. Just a few testimonies here of many. Christian Medical College in Vellore, we did a training with them to introduce them to this. They have an education by extension, and we worked with the mental health unit, and they said this is the best workshop we have ever attended, and we've been to a lot of them. We've seen great situations where people in denominations or different groups of people come together and they have been at odds with one another. But at the end of this, they go out having been reconciled and ready to work together. In Nepal, I personally had the experience where some of my colleagues said, all the pastors in Nepal need this for their own healing. How can we get this to them? A seminary student in the US said, I never knew the Bible was so relevant. And what was very interesting to me was the director of counseling services at Dallas Theological Seminary said, I have to change the way I train after being part of this. Next. Just like to give you sort of our theme verse, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. And that's what we're about, and that's what we would like to join you in what you're doing and help meet the needs of people in the world who have had a wounded heart and are crushed in spirit. Thank you very much. Next slide. Here are some resources and links for you. Go to that COVID-19. We've had tremendous response to our COVID-19 lesson that can be used with just anyone who even hasn't been trained at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that helpful presentation. Just a reminder, if there's any questions that you have for Brian on his presentation, or maybe you have some questions about the training or the Trauma Healing Institute, I just encourage you to ask those questions because we're about to move into a time of asking Paul and Brian any questions that you raise. If for some reason you're not able to use the chat function on YouTube, then please email webinar@ccih.org and someone is waiting for your questions so that we can ask them to Brian and Paul. Before we move into the question time, I just want to remind you, both Brian and Paul have mentioned a variety of resources available. And I'd just like to remind you, if you go to the CCIH website, and that's www.ccih.org. And then if you go to the resources section, there's lots of resources there, but go to mental health, and then you'll find the resources that we've mentioned from today's session there. So Paul and Brian will move into a time of questions. We've got a few coming in, and the first one, Paul, is for you. So Phil from Food for the Hungry has asked for a little more on the community-based models, for you to elaborate on that. He's helpfully shared that we found the participation in care groups, so small groups of women, may protect against depression, and it would be great to hear some more of your reflections on that.
Thank you, and thanks for the great question, Phil. Well, first, just to say that the work that Food for the Hungry and others like World Vision have done to incorporate mental health into core health programming, like care groups, that maternal and child health programming, is just outstanding. And part of what makes it so strong is exactly what I was talking about, the contextualization, the localization, the local ownership. A lot of these models do not have to be that technical and require master's degrees to do well and to bring healing and hope to folks. The sort of work that's happening there, the sort of work that Brian's talking about, where you're bringing people, the core of it is bringing people together to share about their experience, to hear some basic framing and education around what's happening and why it's happening, for them to be able to put words to their emotions. That can be hugely transformative. And you know, what we've found is that the more that those local folks can be leaders in it, can be the ones setting the tone of the conversation, could be using locally appropriate not just language, but metaphors and images and ways of understanding pain. There's deep local resilience in every community around the world. And when we can tap into that and help sort of nurture those healthy healing strategies that folks have and really build on that, it can just be amazingly effective at reducing clinical depression and PTSD and those sort of things. And actually some of the interesting work that Food for the Hungry has found is it can actually reduce malnutrition among the kids of those mothers. So the impacts of this work is just really significant.
Thanks, Paul, for that. I think it's really interesting and completely agree in both your presentations how contextualization came out so strong and really important to delve into that local knowledge and local ways of healing. And so the next question for you, Brian, is also from Phil. Phil, thank you so much for your questions. This is great. He just was sharing how fascinating the method that you shared, how fascinating it is, and wondering how he can get more information on the impact of the intervention. And so maybe if you can talk to us a little bit more about the results that you've seen.
Yes, thank you, Phil, for that question. I would be happy to send some more information. As all research, the data is still has been sifted and working through that data. Some of the significant things were that pastors were saying that within their churches, they were seeing reconciliation. They were seeing people able to cope and come to church and actually be engaged. Another significant thing that I thought was very interesting is it gave the pastors a better understanding of their congregations. It also helped them, the program helped them be able to forgive, and that they saw forgiveness becoming a strong point of their churches. And that there was a direct correlation between emotional health and spiritual health. Those are some of the things that, the results that came out of that. There's lots more too that we're finding from the results.
Thanks, Brian, really helpful. Paul, I think I'll go back to you with this next question from Dr. Daniel O'Neill, and he's wondering, has there been any evaluation in your circles on the trauma prevention and healing for the first 1,000 days? And maybe, Brian, this question is actually also for you. So the trauma prevention and healing for the first 1,000 days in the human development life cycle, so early childhood. Anything that either of you would like to say in response to that question?
That is a great question. And of the approaches that I listed there, the one that has the deepest literature that I'm aware of in this area would be coming out of public health. And, there's a lot of literature on adverse childhood events, or ACEs, and the impact of traumas that traumas can have, not just on mental health, but on physical health development, on social development for the rest of someone's life. And the earlier those happen, and the more of them there are, the worse those impacts are. And so, yeah, there's good evidence out there that if we can, so taking a public health lens, if we can prevent exposure, that can reduce those issues. We can also, there are good intervention strategies to keep that exposure from translating into ill health. And then finally, there's sort of your tertiary care methods of, okay, bad things have developed, depression or anxiety or physical health problems or a problem with the law or whatever. And then there's interventions sort of after the fact. How do you mitigate those impacts and get people back on a track towards healing? And there'd be strategies from across that range of approaches that could address any of those different pathways. For example, rights-based approaches that help put in place better laws that can prevent violence from happening in the first place, or ensuring that if there is traumatic exposure, if someone suffered sexual and gender-based violence, that they can actually get care quickly. All of that can prevent those issues down the road. I think I'll stop there, but turn it over to Brian if you have more to add on that.
Not a lot. We haven't focused particularly on doing that because it's so much just a community and lay kind of program. And yet those who work in the children's program are very aware of the fact that at very young ages, just how affected people become. And then of course, once people come to their community of adults and are in healing groups, we find many of them can look back to times when they were 2 or 3 that something happened to them that has affected them in their life.
Thank you, Brian and Paul, for responding to that question. Brian, I'll stay with you for the next question. You'd mentioned how the model in your presentation has been used in many countries and languages, which is incredible, and also with other cultures and religions. And the question is, who has translated the materials and decided on the content? And maybe you can just give a bit more background on how the content is being developed.
Right. So we are trying to be very responsive as the program continues to evolve. After 20 years, it's just, gone everywhere. And we even came up with a list the other day of different topics that are continually being asked for. When we go to other places, what we want is we want people who are going to be translating or involved in content. We first want them to experience the program in the most appropriate way for them so that they know what we're talking about, know what the concepts are. And then we work with a group of people who are local so that we know what are the biggest issues, what is a story set, what are the things that are going on. For instance, in some countries, like persecution is a huge thing. And so the story set somehow affects that, or a witchcraft society in which women are accused of being witches. How does that affect their lives? And so a story set is developed based on some of those situations. And then those people who are from different religions, so far the Muslim is the most targeted yet of a different religion, but we are working with people who are of the Islamic faith and getting their responses, helping to understand how does this work, what is acceptable, how can it be helpful, and what are the things that they are dealing with. So there's definite local and national involvement in the process.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. Paul, this next question is for you from Rolando, former executive director of MCC, so I'm sure someone you know. He's asking, might you comment on the sister care program working with women groups in different countries of the world?
Yes, good question. Hi, Rolando. The sister care program, and you can look it up to learn more about it, is a great example of really leaning into people's their inbuilt resilience and their contextualized sources of strength and support. And so as in many of these other more community-based models, there's so much power in people being able to share with one another in a way where they can feel comfortable, which honestly often means women's groups being separate from men's groups and teenagers being able to talk separately from their parents. And this is a good example of that, where you're bringing women together and really doing customized curriculum and sharing experiences based on their context and their culture and their experience. And once you've sort of developed that sort of a flexible model, it's very easy for that to be replicated around the world in different contexts with deep local contextualization.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Rolando, for that question. This question's great, and actually I just had an email from one of our clients the other day asking the same thing. And this could be for both of you actually as well. So in your line of work, have you faced any form of resistance? And if so, from whom? So Brian, do you want to start on that?
Sure. No, of course, we've had no resistance at all. No, I'm kidding. Yes. Actually, sometimes we've had resistance from professional health, mental health professionals. But by and large, when they take the time to go through the program themselves and let it sink in, they come out believers. And it's been amazing to see how many mental health professionals are part of this program. And they even take off their counseling hat when they go into a healing group to just be a facilitator. And one other thing that is often is, oh, I don't think you can get people to talk about this, depending on what country you're in. You know, well, the women are never going to talk about that, or the men are never going to talk about it. No one's going to open up. No one's going to share. 100%. I have never seen that happen. Everyone is ready to talk if you provide a safe environment. You know, dividing men and women sometimes, dividing youth and older people. But when you provide that safe environment to build a community, people start talking and they are willing and ready to share.
Thanks, Brian. That's definitely our experience at Thrive as well, as we hold groups for different people, whether it's in Somalia to the UK to
exactly.
Yeah, it's a really great point. Paul, anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would, two things. One is just to say that like resistance can happen, sort of overt resistance where people are pushing back. And then the other type of resistance that happens in health programming or any programming around the world is people politely come to the training or the whatever, and then they go home about their lives. And what we found in our evaluation was that when programs failed to contextualize, there was deep resistance. Maybe it wasn't expressed at the event, but there was deep resistance. So in Afghanistan, when we looked at programming that did not take seriously that religious and cultural context, how is this relevant to me? How can I share about this in a rural community if it doesn't connect to how people make sense of the world? So that is the area that I think there's been some of the biggest resistance. The second area where there's been resistance is when people don't understand these different approaches, their strengths and their weaknesses. They are not a one size fits all. And, you know, a community healing model like what Brian's talking about is not going to be the answer to every case of post-traumatic stress disorder and clinical depression. And when different practitioners think that their lane is all that there is and discount everything that's happening everywhere else, they're going to create resistance, and they're creating false expectations of healing and hope that their model cannot do. And so really trying to emphasize these different approaches having different strengths, different weaknesses, and people being clear about the limits of their capacity and what their project is actually going to do and what it's not going to do.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, everyone. There's lots of great questions coming through. Doris, I just want to thank you for that question from Zimbabwe. That was really great. A couple of really interesting questions here. Can trauma healing be trauma healing when you're still living every day in a traumatic situation where your rights are violated? And that's definitely something I've heard come up as a really key question, especially in locations where rights are abused or there's ongoing conflict on a regular basis. And so, Brian, maybe do you want to respond to that? What does that look like in the countries where you work, where this is a challenge?
Right. It's a huge challenge. And many times the responses or the ways in which we can help people are better done when people are able to be out of the situation that they're in. But that's just not the reality for many people. We do talk about, okay, what can you do given your situation? Let's talk about domestic abuse just for a second here. Domestic abuse is everywhere. And in many contexts, to say, oh, well, just come up with a plan so that you can leave when it gets bad. Well, that just isn't an option in many, many parts of the world. What can we do to emotionally, at least, help people remember and speak truth to themselves in the event, in the situation of constant domestic abuse? What can we do at that point? It's not always what we would like, but definitely this is an issue, and we try to address it on many different topics. What can you do given the givens?
Thanks, Brian. Paul, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think this again comes back to this question of when are different approaches appropriate or not, and what are their weaknesses. And so, you know, one of the critiques of community healing types of approaches sometimes is it can feel like it's trying to make people passive in the face of injustice, that like figure out a way to get over it, and not address those systemic issues. And so we need to be very cautious about that. You know, are we telling people to find a way to forgive and get over it, without addressing those root problems?
Mm-hmm.
You know, similarly in mental health, the strategies for post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, those clinical treatments are counterindicated in many cases if people are in actively unsafe situations, because what they're doing is lowering your state of arousal and defense mechanisms. And those defense mechanisms are protective. And so when there are good reasons why, if someone is in an active abuse situation, a situation where they are not safe, some of these strategies can actually be quite harmful. And we need to be careful about what we're doing when we're dealing with issues this powerful.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Paul. Really important. 3 words: do no harm. And so it's knowing which is the appropriate tool, the appropriate approach for each situation. And you mentioned the word forgiveness. So I'm going to go to the next question that has that in there from Paul at SIL. Paul shares, one mistake I think some evangelicals in the US make is a rush to forgiveness. So how do these Bible-based approaches treat forgiveness as a process that occurs in time? And so, Brian, I think that one, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about this. Forgiveness is one of the most difficult lessons, sessions we have, and it shouldn't be rushed. We try to emphasize the fact that forgiveness is a process, and you only come to forgiveness when you're ready. You can't force people to forgive. It is an important part of the healing process. Whether you're a Christian or not, that is found as being very significant for healing. And yet it's true that sometimes I will just forgive and get on with it. Well, we do a lot of time take a lot of time really thinking about, well, what is forgiveness? Is it, trusting the other person again? Well, no. Is it reconciliation? No. Could be, but it's not always. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what is forgiveness, and culturally, what do people expect from forgiveness? And we really emphasize, we have different exercises and stuff to show that this will take time, and you'll make progress and you'll slip back, and you may not be ready, and that's okay. So that's how we deal with that very difficult situation. Yes, it's very difficult.
Thank you, Brian. I think we have time for a couple more quick questions. So one here from SM8 International in Ghana. Can you practically integrate the trauma response into other interventions and programs? So really interesting question there. And Paul, do you want to start on that one?
Absolutely. So this, I would tie back to Phil Moses's first question on how they've integrated these kind of mental health approaches into a maternal and child health program, care groups. It is very possible. These issues of trauma are deeply connected with so much of the work that organizations around the world are doing, members of CCIH are doing. And so making progress on those sometimes requires these sort of efforts. So for example, MCC has a lot of education programs working with for displaced people or folks who have suffered significant violence. And oftentimes addressing trauma effectively is a first step before those kids can learn effectively. And so, yes, I would say there's a lot of ways to incorporate this well. I would just encourage people not to just mix everything into a pot and then hope for the magical outcomes on the other end, but to keep those theories of change distinct with the literature that supports them, and then evaluating those different parts to see what's happening. So that if you're combining it with another kind of health program, measure those indicators separately, understanding why those are going together based on a rigorous needs assessment. It doesn't belong in every project. Not each of these models should be used everywhere. So why are you picking this model? What is the outcome you're looking for? And then trying to keep those distinct while developing holistic programming.
That's really great, Paul. I think a lot of really really good advice in there. And actually, I think the thing that's just really struck me as you were sharing is how if we know where trauma healing is best appropriate, it can unlock so much more, like education and so many more. Brian, I'm going to ask you our last question. So this question is from Richard in DRC. And Richard's asking, is the healing process standard or adapted to the depth of trauma that an individual or community might be experiencing?
Right, that's a good question. As Paul's saying, you know, we do contextualize, but there are some basic standard things that people need to be able to do to find healing. For instance, being able to tell your story to someone who listens well is the first and one of the best ways of beginning the healing process of a traumatic event and the effect it's had in your life. That can be done differently, and it will require different levels of resilience and understanding from the person who's listening to someone, depending on the depth of their trauma. We try to help people be enough informed that they can respond to trauma when it's appropriate. But also, if there is a depth of trauma that is beyond that particular healing group, or they need more help, we're always telling people, you need to know what your resources are. You need to know, are there counselors around? Are there medical experts who have some background in some mental health? Or even if it's just a very well-known, a knowledgeable pastor who can intervene when the trauma is beyond what a community-based intervention can do. So we have ways in which we try to adapt for the different stages of depths of trauma, but the basic underlying foundations are often similar across any kind of trauma.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think that's a really neat way to close and kind of brings us full circle back to Paul's presentation in many ways, recognizing the different framework and actually where clinical health was on that framework, and then community health. And again, I think one of the key messages coming out is knowing what's the appropriate response for the local context and the situation
Absolutely.
that is involved. I would just like to say thank you very much to each of the participants for joining us today. Thank you. It's been great to have people from the US, Zimbabwe, DRC, Ghana, and lots of different locations. So thank you for joining us. We do hope that you enjoyed this session. There are more sessions coming up on changing funding environment, health system strengthening, community-based programs and advocacy. And so if you haven't registered for any of those and you'd like to, please visit www.ccih.org to see the full schedule and to access the registration link. And a reminder, we've talked about a lot of different resources, and so please do visit the CCIH website for a great selection of resources, not just from this session, but if you are interested in accessing any of the resources that Paul and Brian have spoken about, please go to the resources section and then to mental health, and there you can find links to further information. Thank you to Brian and Paul for your presentations today. Really appreciated. And I'm just going to close this in prayer as we wrap up this session. So dear Father, we just thank you for the technology today so that we can connect from so many countries around the world, Lord. Father, I thank you for the work of SIL and MCC and ask your blessing upon each of those organizations. Father, I thank you for each participant that joined today. And Lord, I just pray for your equipping as they go out and continue the work that they're doing. And I just pray, Lord, for the birth of the different seeds that you've sown from today's sessions as people think about integration. Lord, we pray for healing for those that are participating today that are struggling with trauma. And we ask for your healing hand upon each person. Lord, we want to give you glory in all of this, in all the work that both SIL and CCIH and MCC are involved with. So Lord, we lift this up to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are.